Hello, my name is Daniel Crumbine, and I'm a philosophy, neuroscience, and psychology major here at ASU. Today, I want to talk about everyone's most hated topic, the social issue of veganism and vegetarianism. In this video, I hope to outline utilitarianism's core values, how speciesism has led people to neglect utilitarian thinking in respect to other animals, and then to finish us off, some interesting counterpoints to why veganism is not a necessary conclusion for a non-speciesist utilitarian, as well as other counterexamples to some popular thought experiments. The most popular contemporary philosopher that talks about such an issue is Peter Singer, a prominent utilitarian. But before we get into anything specific, let's define and talk about some key terms for a second. First off, what is utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is an ethical belief system that believes that what is good is what maximizes the most amount of happiness. So for an action to be good, it must bring about the maximal amount of happiness and/or pleasure for everyone. This is also a consequentialist theory, meaning that what matters are the consequences of someone's actions, not the intents or wishes. For example, let us imagine that there are two women. One of them donates $100 to charity because she really cares and thinks that she has a duty to help others. The other donates $1,000 to the same charity, but only because she thinks it will make her look good. Under the utilitarian consequentialist theory, woman B has acted considerably better. A key tenet of utilitarianism that is separate from this is also that it is other regarding and egalitarian. What it means to be egalitarian is that it does not regard any singular person's happiness above the happiness of another person. And other regarding means that this even includes your own happiness. So when you're thinking of what you should be doing, you need to not only include what will make you happy, but what will maximize the happiness for most other people. This idea of being other regarding has led to some interesting topics in the philosophical community on utilitarianism. And the main question is, who is deserving of moral consideration under utilitarianism? Ought we to consider the maximizing of happiness for all humans? That answer seems to be an obvious yes, but what about pets, dolphins, great apes, other animals? Must we go all the way down to the common ant? Philosophers that ask these questions beg the thinker to discern what is the basis for all humans getting moral consideration, and what's the difference between the animals that don't deserve moral consideration. This belief is called speciesism, the belief that some animals and some species of animals are more worthy or better than others. Peter Singer argues that speciesism is something to be avoided and has created the terminology and framework to compare it to the other isms, namely sexism, racism, and classism. The parallels that he draws between speciesism and the other isms are eerily similar, and they all have to do that the mistreatment of other people based on demographics has always been rooted in believing that the other humans were somehow fundamentally different than the ruling class of humans, by way of intelligence, emotion, consciousness, or autonomy. When you think of why people thought it was acceptable to own slaves a couple hundred years ago, it's because they thought that the slaves were somehow less than human. When you think about why men believe that women weren't supposed to own property, it's somehow that they were fundamentally different by way of intelligence or emotion. Now, a typical answer for the opponents of animal rights is that there is some missing property of animals that humans have and animals don't. Now, this oftentimes is intelligence, emotion, consciousness, or autonomy. Now, that sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? As an argument against this missing property claim, Peter Singer and Tom Regan outline the following argument. It is important to note, however, that neither of these men actually believe the conclusion. In fact, they think that the conclusion is so repugnant that one of the premises must be incorrect. They simply make this argument to point out a major flaw in the missing property claim. And this is how the basic argument goes in these four premises. Premise 1. What makes humans deserving of moral consideration is some important mental property X. Note that mental property X can be anything from intelligence to emotions, any of those four things that we've described. 2. Thus, A living being is deserving of moral consideration if and only if the living being has important mental property X. This can be derived from 1. Premise number 3. Animals do not have mental property X. This is the fundamental assumption that speciesists make, and this is why they think that their speciesism is somehow justified. And then 4, the conclusion is thus animals are not deserving of moral consideration. This is done through a biconditional modus tollens from premises 2 and 3. Singer believes that if you use this argument, it's open to an absurd inference that is very, very antithetical to what Singer believes that if you use this argument, you can state an additional true premise that will get you to an abhorrent conclusion. And this is premise number 5. Severely mentally disabled humans do not have mental property X. And so when he says this, he notes that when you compare the inner machinations of the mind of a bonobo ape and a severely disabled human being, there is no significant material difference. In fact, there may be some apes with higher functioning mental capacity than some severely disabled humans. And using the biconditional modus tollens, you get this abhorrent conclusion. Thus, severely mentally disabled humans are not deserving of moral consideration. Now, this is obviously not true and is a repugnant conclusion. It's so clearly wrong that it leads Peter Singer to reject premise 1. Instead, he maintains a separate premise. What makes humans deserving of moral consideration is their capacity to feel and understand pain. Unfortunately for the speciesist, this changes the argument to this. 1. What makes humans deserving of moral consideration is the capacity to feel and understand pain. Thus, a living being is deserving of moral consideration if and only if the living being has some capacity to feel and understand pain. Now, when you get to the third premise, no one can argue that animals have the capacity to feel and understand pain. So you get the conclusion that Peter Singer wants. Thus, some animals are deserving of moral consideration. What's great about this changing of the argument is that it satisfies our basic moral intuition that severely mental disabilities do not forfeit someone of their rights. And Peter Singer then transitions this argument against speciesism to his basic belief that most everyone should be a vegan or vegetarian, or at least be trying as hard as one reasonably can to be a vegan. It seems like a fairly basic argument and can be outlined in these premises. This is an argument from David deGrazia. Premise 1. It is morally impermissible to knowingly cause or support practices that cause extensive unnecessary harm to living beings deserving of moral consideration. 2. If it is morally impermissible to knowingly cause or support practices that cause extensive unnecessary harm to living beings deserving of moral consideration, then minimizing the harm from practices that knowingly cause extensive and unnecessary harm to living beings deserving of moral consideration is morally obligatory. 3 is the simple conclusion by way of modus ponens, and says, thus, minimizing the harm from practices that knowingly cause extensive and unnecessary harm to living beings deserving of moral consideration is morally obligatory. 4, the best moral way to minimize the harm from a cause of harm is to not support or cause that harm. Seems very basic and not available to counterexample. 5, if the best moral way to minimize the harm from a cause of harm is to not support or cause said harm, and minimizing the harm from practices that knowingly cause extensive and unnecessary harm to animals is morally obligatory, then one is morally required to choose the food option that causes less extensive and unnecessary harm to living beings deserving of moral consideration. 6, thus, one is morally required to choose the food option that causes less extensive and unnecessary harm to living beings deserving of moral consideration. This is a modus ponens inference from statements 3 and 4 and 5. 7, strict vegetarians choose the food option that causes the least unnecessary and extensive harm to living beings deserving of moral consideration. This seems fairly basic and not really open to counterexample. And 8, thus, strict vegetarianism is morally obligatory, and you get this from 6 and 7. Note that this argument is logically valid by sole usage of modus ponens, so the only way to disagree with this conclusion of this argument is disagree with premises 1, 2, 4, 5, or 7. Now that these arguments have been laid out, unless you have a reasonable counterexample to one of the premises stated, you may be a little worried that you are morally required to be a vegetarian. Fortunately for you, there are some fantastic critiques of both of these arguments posited by Peter Singer. The first argument is for the moral consideration argument. While the original argument is obviously flawed, given that it would strip some humans of moral consideration, there seems to be an easy fix to the problem presented by Singer. If you change the requirement for moral consideration to the counterfactual capacity to have mental property X, this sidesteps the entire counterexample put forth by Singer. This is because while animals do not have the counterfactual capacity to have mental capacity X, severely mentally disabled humans do. The second critique is for the factory harm argument. Many people do not require the moral consideration argument to accept the basic premises that animals are deserving of some moral consideration. Because of this, the factory harm argument still applies to them. In fact, if you substitute living beings deserving of moral consideration with animals, the argument still seems to be sound. This critique is put forth by Donald Bruckner. Bruckner has a problem with premise 5 and thinks that there is another inference that can be made if we were to use the same logic as those that believe in the factory harm argument. And other arguments can be made for separate ways of getting food that cause less animal deaths than industrial farming of plant-based foods. The inference in question leads to a rather absurd conclusion, and so on the basis of reductio ad absurdum, he rejects the factory harm argument. So here is the argument. Premise 8. One is morally required to choose the food option that causes less extensive and unnecessary harm to animals. This is a repetition of premise 6 from factory harm. Premise 9. Industrial farming of plant-based foods cause a lot of animal deaths in the farming process. Now, if you don't know about this, that's absolutely fine, but the industrial farming of plant-based foods, whether it be corn or zucchini, no matter what, in the act of actually pulling up all of the produce, you are killing tons of rabbits and vermin and coyotes and numerous other small mammals that are just going to die simply for the fact that they get caught within the rotors, etc., etc. Additionally, with all the pesticides, you are contributing to the deaths of many, many animals. Now, this is not to say that somehow industrial farming of plant-based foods kills more animals than the industrial farming of animals. This is because in order to feed the animals, you have to then farm plants to give to the animals. So the animal deaths caused by animal production through industrial farming is always going to be higher than industrial farming of plant-based foods. Here's where we get to the interesting premise of this whole thing, which is number 10. Roadkill causes no unnecessary and extensive harm to animals. This simply just seems to be a fact. If you find a dead animal, you have caused no harm to it. And then you get to premise number 11, which is if industrial farming of plant-based foods cause a lot of animal deaths in the farming process, and roadkill causes no unnecessary extensive harm to animals, and one is morally required to choose the food option that causes less extensive and unnecessary harm to animals, then one is morally obliged to eat roadkill. Thus, one is morally obliged to eat roadkill, and that's where you get to this insane conclusion. Because if one is morally obliged to eat roadkill, first off, one cannot follow strict vegetarianism. But secondly, Bruckner presents us with this new dilemma. Either one is morally required to be a strict vegetarian that eats roadkill whenever available, or something is deeply wrong in the factory harm argument. Common sense tells us the option that it morally requires us to eat roadkill whenever available is obviously incorrect. Thus, the factory harm argument does not provide us with a solid reason to abstain from eating animals. This is because the vegetarian's abstinence of eating roadkill has nothing to do with morally binding reasons and everything to do with preference. And if a vegetarian is willing to give up the fact that no, they don't have to eat roadkill because of preference, then it obviously provides the meat eater with reasons not to eat plants and instead to eat animals because of preference. The vegetarian can, of course, bite the bullet and simply say, yes, I am obliged to be a strict vegetarian when I can and also eat roadkill whenever I can. However, in real arguments, this is never going to happen, and I have yet to meet anyone that would legitimately. The third argument against vegetarianism is not connected to Peter Singer, but is one that should appeal to his utilitarian belief system. This essay was put forth by Thomas Sittler, for which he won an Oxford Prize, in which he outlines the commonly held belief and argument by moral vegetarians for why people should not consume or buy meat, and then attacks one of the most basic premises. It is important to recognize that in the Sittler version of farmed animals, he is talking about those that live outside of the industrialized agricultural sphere of production, things like free-range animals. So premise 1. Farmed animals have lives that are filled with more pain than pleasure. 2. If animals have lives that are filled with more pain than pleasure, then we should not assist in creating them. 3. Thus, we should not assist in creating more lives of farmed animals. Premise 4. Thus, do not purchase meat products. Sittler brings up an interesting point, however. Wild animals, although they may enjoy a little more freedom, endure significantly worse living conditions. Many of them die in terrible ways, suffer starvation regularly, and are under constant threat of being killed at any moment. Furthermore, most of them will see a vast majority of their children fail to make it to adulthood and perish. A second point is that there are significantly more wild animals than farmed animals, by the magnitudes of billions of lives. Thus, he argues, if moral vegetarians are focused on the prevention of lives that are not worth living, then they should be focused on the problem of wild animal suffering, because in comparison, farmed animals are enduring much less pain and experiencing much more pleasure. For example, they could reduce animal populations by sterilizing them or by destroying highly dense animal habitats such as rainforests, even though this would place them at direct odds with environmentalists who are trying to preserve nature from human intervention. It may even be the case that vegetarians should react to this argument by eating more meat, because feeding of livestock requires more surface area for agriculture, and fields contain far fewer wild animals per square kilometer than other biomes such as forests. The main point that Sittler is trying to make is that animal suffering is occurring on a much, much larger scale in the wild than it is within our own agricultural systems. As such, if you are a utilitarian and are trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, your attention should be on this issue rather than the issue of farmed animals. One intuitive response to wild animal suffering could be that the cycles of predation and starvation are natural, and so they're morally neutral. This is a terrible argument because what is natural is not always good. I think this is fairly obvious, but if you need an example, COVID, for example, is a naturally occurring disease, and letting people die from it would be natural. However, that is morally abhorrent. What I think is particularly interesting, in fact, is that you can actually use agricultural farming to decrease the amount of pain and experienced by wild animals. And so there may in fact be a reason from the moral vegetarian's view that's utilitarian to actually increase agriculture and the farming of animals. Here's the outlined argument and premise and inference form. Premise 5, wild animals have lives that are filled with more pain and less pleasure than farmed animals, and there are significantly more wild animals than farmed animals. Premise 6, if there are two competing problems to assist with, a utilitarian should prioritize the problem that has more moral weight to it. Thus, utilitarians should prioritize the pain and pleasure of wild animals. This, I think, overall is an interesting argument against vegetarianism, simply because it's saying that the problems that the vegetarian is trying to argue about do not matter in terms of the grand scale. That's the last argument I have for you today. Hopefully today you should have learned about utilitarianism, speciesism, and vegetarianism. You should have learned about some popular arguments surrounding what living beings are worth moral consideration, what you should be thinking about when talking about what requires moral consideration, as well as some vegetarian arguments and the critiques of said arguments for vegetarianism. I hope you have a wonderful day and have a guilt-free steak on me. If anyone is interested, here is a list of all the papers that I am citing, as well as the philosophers that I gathered my ideas from.